It is an honor to stand before you today to discuss a pivotal moment in the history of Burkina Faso and the broader African geopolitical landscape. The rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré has captured the attention of the world not just because of his military leadership, but because of the profound impact his actions have had on the fate of an entire nation. In the past few years, Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa, has been grappling with the complexities of internal conflict, political instability, and an escalating insurgency. These challenges were rooted in years of economic hardship, regional instability, and the struggle against jihadist insurgencies that have plagued the Sahel region. The country was left vulnerable and uncertain, struggling to maintain control over large swaths of its territory and protect its citizens from the grip of militant violence. In the face of this crisis, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young and determined military officer, emerged as a leader of change. He seized power during a critical juncture, when Burkina Faso's previous leadership had faltered in addressing the nation's growing challenges. As a key figure in the military, Captain Traoré sought to deliver a solution to the suffering Burkinabe people. The coup that brought him to power was not just an exercise in military might, but a reflection of the dissatisfaction that had permeated the country. The people of Burkina Faso were tired of weak leadership and the inability of the government to protect them from the increasing attacks on civilians by extremist groups. They needed decisive action and a strong response. Ibrahim Traoré's rise to prominence was a direct response to these needs. The military takeover, though controversial, was seen by many as a step toward re-establishing control and providing a semblance of order in a nation in crisis. What Captain Traoré has demonstrated since assuming leadership is a mix of pragmatism, nationalistic resolve, and a commitment to the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. He understood the need to recalibrate the country's military strategy, strengthen national security forces, and forge alliances that would help curb the growing threat of terrorism in the region. His administration has sought to re-engage with regional organizations, such as the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and explore strategic partnerships with other African and global powers. His leadership, however, has not been without challenges. The international community has expressed concerns over the legitimacy of the coup and the direction of the country's democratic transition. Some see his rise as a setback for the ideals of democracy and constitutional governance. But within Burkina Faso, many view Captain Traoré as a symbol of hope, a leader who is trying to reclaim control over a nation that has long been at the mercy of forces beyond its control. As Captain Traoré has repeatedly emphasized, the priority of his government is the safety and security of the Burkinabe people. He has taken bold steps to ensure that the military and security forces are better equipped to fight terrorism, stabilize the country, and maintain law and order. Yet his task is far from easy. The terrain of political and military challenges that he faces is complex, and his government must walk a fine line between securing the nation and ensuring that it does not become isolated on the international stage. In many ways, the actions of Captain Ibrahim Traoré encapsulate the broader struggle of African nations that are caught between the demands of internal peace and the pressures of external political expectations. His rise is a reminder of the complexities that face leaders in regions marked by conflict, but it is also a testament to the resilience of the people of Burkina Faso, who continue to seek stability and peace in the face of adversity. The journey ahead for Captain Traoré and Burkina Faso is uncertain. The challenges are immense, and the weight of leadership rests heavily on his shoulders. Yet his actions will undoubtedly shape the future of his country and perhaps even the future of West Africa. What remains to be seen is how he will balance the competing pressures of governance, military necessity, and the aspirations of a people longing for peace, security, and prosperity. In conclusion, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rise and the circumstances that led to his leadership have captured global attention. His ability to navigate the complex political and military landscape of Burkina Faso in the coming years will be critical in determining the country's trajectory. While questions remain about the legitimacy and long-term sustainability of his rule, one thing is clear. Burkina Faso is at a crossroads, and Captain Traore has emerged as a central figure in its effort to reshape its future. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa, has been facing a multitude of crises in recent years, with political instability, economic hardship, and an increasingly violent insurgency threatening its national security. These challenges have been compounded by the growing presence of extremist groups in the Sahel region, a vast stretch of land across Africa that has seen escalating violence over the past decade. The country, like many in the region, has been caught in the crossfire of a broader battle against radicalization and terrorism, and the consequences have been dire. The roots of Burkina Faso's instability can be traced back to a combination of factors, including economic challenges, weak governance, and social inequality. While the country has made some strides in its development over the years, it remains one of the poorest in the world, with a significant portion of its population living below the poverty line. The government in previous years was struggling to provide basic services such as healthcare, education, and employment opportunities for its citizens, leading to a growing sense of frustration and disillusionment among the Burkinabe people. However, the situation took a sharp turn for the worse, as extremist groups, primarily those affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, began to make significant inroads into the country. Burkina Faso, previously seen as relatively stable compared to its neighbors, became a target for these groups, who exploited the porous borders, weak state structures, and economic inequalities. The insurgency quickly spread from the northern regions, where extremist groups had already established a foothold, to the central and southern parts of the country. The violence became more widespread, and the frequency of attacks on civilians, security forces, and government institutions increased dramatically. The government's response to the insurgency was woefully inadequate. Despite receiving support from international partners, including France and the United States, the Burkinabe military was not prepared to confront the scale of the crisis. Many of the country's security forces lacked proper training, equipment, and resources, leaving them ill-equipped to deal with the insurgents. Furthermore, the civilian population found itself caught between the military and extremist forces, with limited protection from either side. As the violence escalated, the state's authority began to erode, and many areas were effectively abandoned to the control of insurgent groups. The inability of the government to provide security, protect citizens, and regain control of the country's territory contributed to widespread dissatisfaction with the ruling leadership. People were left without basic protections, living in fear of extremist attacks, displacement, and the collapse of social services. The government, under President Rochemar Christian Kabore, was seen by many as ineffective, with a lack of decisive action and a failure to address the root causes of the conflict. Public protests against the government's handling of the security situation intensified as people demanded action and accountability. As the insurgency deepened and public discontent grew, it became clear that the government's failure to address these issues had created a power vacuum. In January 2022, a group of military officers led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba staged a coup, ousting President Kabore. Damiba promised to restore security and stabilize the country, but his administration struggled to make significant progress. Despite initial support from the population, Damiba's government was soon seen as unable to deliver on its promises, and attacks by extremist groups continued unabated. This growing frustration with the government's failure to tackle the insurgency set the stage for Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power. In September 2022, Traore, a young and relatively unknown military officer, led another coup, overthrowing Damiba. His actions were seen by many as a response to the mounting crisis and the perceived inadequacy of both the previous government and the military leadership to effectively address the worsening security situation. Traore positioned himself as a figure of hope, a leader capable of taking bold action to restore stability to Burkina Faso and ensure the protection of its people. Traoré's coup was largely supported by the population, many of whom had lost faith in the government's ability to protect them from the growing violence and instability. His promise to prioritize national security and take decisive action against insurgents resonated deeply with a population that had been living under constant threat for years. The burden of political and military failure that had been building up over time created the conditions for Traoré's rise, with the people of Burkina Faso hoping that his leadership would bring an end to the country's downward spiral into chaos. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's emergence as a central figure in Burkina Faso's turbulent political landscape was marked by a combination of military opportunism and a deep understanding of the frustrations felt by the country's population. At just 34 years old, Traoré was a relatively young officer, yet his rise to power was both swift and impactful. His path to leadership began in the wake of growing dissatisfaction with the handling of the insurgency, a series of government failures, and a general sense of hopelessness among the Burkinabe people who had seen their country descend into chaos. In September 2022, Traoré's actions as part of a group of military officers led to the overthrow of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Horede Sandaogo Damiba, the leader of Burkina Faso following the January 2022 coup. The coup that brought Damiba to power had promised to tackle the escalating violence in the country, but despite initial optimism, it became clear that the military government was struggling to bring security to the population. The extremist attacks continued to increase, and the military's inability to secure large portions of the country only fueled the public's sense of despair and frustration. In such an environment, Traoré, who was serving in the military, saw an opportunity to seize the moment and take control. Traoré's coup was not just a military takeover, but a political statement in response to the apparent failure of both Damiba and the civilian government under President Rochemar Christian Kabore. The sense of betrayal among the Burkinabe people was palpable, and the country was ripe for a leadership change. By ousting Damiba, Traoré tapped into the growing sentiment that a more decisive, dynamic, and robust leadership was needed, one capable of addressing the dire security situation head-on and restoring some semblance of order to the country. Captain Traoré was keenly aware of the deepening crisis in Burkina Faso and knew that his actions would be seen not just as a military takeover, but as a response to the urgent demands of the people for change. The country's security forces, which were already under intense pressure due to the expanding insurgency, were further weakened by the ineffective leadership of Damiba. As attacks from jihadist groups continued to spread, the population began to lose faith in the ability of the state to protect them, and many saw Damiba's regime as part of the problem rather than the solution. This created the perfect environment for Traoré's coup to take hold. One of the central aspects of Traoré's rise to power was his ability to tap into the frustrations of the general population. Burkina Faso's people had witnessed their country deteriorate into a war zone, with civilian casualties mounting and the state's control over its territory shrinking. The Burkinabe people felt that their government had failed them, and they longed for a leader who could restore security and stability. In many ways, Traoré positioned himself as that leader. His rise was not driven by personal ambition alone, but by a clear understanding of the country's urgent need for strong, decisive leadership in the face of growing terrorism and internal strife. What set Traoré apart from his predecessors was his willingness to challenge the established military leadership and political order, emphasizing the need for radical change. Unlike Damiba, who was seen as struggling to come to terms with the magnitude of the crisis, Traoré's promises were rooted in the urgent need to secure the country and confront the extremist forces head-on. His rhetoric focused on the restoration of Burkina Faso's sovereignty, the protection of its people, and the need to pursue a more aggressive counter-terrorism strategy. However, Traoré's coup was not universally welcomed. While many Burkinabe citizens viewed his actions as a necessary step, there were also concerns about the long-term consequences of yet another military takeover. Burkina Faso had already experienced one coup in January 2022, and the idea of military rule returning to the country once again raised questions about the future of democracy and governance. Despite these concerns, Traore managed to position himself as a leader who understood the dire situation facing the nation and was determined to act where others had failed. His appeal, in many respects, lay in his perceived willingness to take bold action, something that had been lacking in the previous administrations. Traore's ability to unite various factions of the military and present a clear, decisive vision for the country won him considerable support, not only within the ranks of the military, but also among civilians who were desperate for a change in leadership. As a young officer, his actions reflected the younger generation's desire for a break from the past and a shift toward more aggressive, security-focused governance. His leadership style, while still unfolding, appeared to emphasize pragmatism and a no-nonsense approach to tackling the insurgency, a stark contrast to the more cautious and reactive strategies of his predecessors. In many ways, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's emergence marked a turning point in Burkina Faso's ongoing struggle with terrorism and political instability. His rise to power was both a response to the failures of the previous governments and a reflection of the desperation of a population that had been left vulnerable to extremist violence for too long. Although questions remain about the legitimacy of his coup and the future of his leadership, his ability to act decisively in a moment of national crisis has cemented his place as one of the key figures shaping the future of Burkina Faso. After Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed power in September 2022, his first and foremost priority was the restoration of security to a country plagued by an escalating insurgency. Burkina Faso, once a relatively stable nation, had seen its territory gradually eroded by extremist groups, primarily associated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. These groups exploited the country's weak military capabilities, porous borders, and socio-economic instability, turning large areas of the country into conflict zones. Traoré understood that to regain control over the country and restore faith in the government, a shift in security strategy was essential. His military leadership and focus on national security became the defining elements of his rule. Burkina Faso's security forces under the previous administrations were overwhelmed by the scale of the insurgency. The government had struggled to provide the necessary training, equipment, and resources to its military and police forces, leaving them ill-prepared to handle the growing threat. In the face of relentless attacks by extremist factions, the country's military was stretched thin, and public confidence in its ability to protect citizens began to wane. Traoré recognized that to stem the tide of insecurity and regain the trust of the people, he needed to focus on reorganizing and strengthening the military. One of Traoré's first actions upon taking power was to bolster the capacity of Burkina Faso's armed forces. He ordered a comprehensive assessment of the military's readiness and capabilities, identifying key areas that needed urgent attention. The country's military had long suffered from insufficient resources, inadequate training, and a lack of modern equipment. Under Traoré's leadership, efforts were made to address these deficiencies. He sought to secure better equipment for the forces, particularly in terms of weapons, communication tools, and vehicles, to ensure that the military could mount an effective response to the insurgency. Equally important was the need for a strategic overhaul in the way the military operated. Traoré recognized that combating a decentralized insurgency required a more flexible and adaptive military structure, one that could respond swiftly to the fluid nature of the conflict. This involved improving intelligence capabilities and creating a more agile force capable of moving quickly and decisively to counter extremist activities. In addition to strengthening the conventional military units, Traoré emphasized the importance of intelligence gathering and collaboration with local communities, whose support would be crucial in identifying and neutralizing insurgents. In line with his focus on military readiness, Captain Traore made efforts to enhance the role of local security forces in ensuring the safety of civilians. Traditional military forces, while vital, were not always able to provide the necessary protection in rural and remote areas. To address this, Traore implemented strategies that involved empowering local militias and community-based security groups to play a more active role in securing their own neighborhood. This was part of a broader strategy to create a more resilient and decentralized security apparatus, one that could operate effectively across the country's diverse and often difficult terrain. Traore also sought to re-establish control over territories that had fallen into the hands of extremist groups. The insurgency had fragmented the country, with certain regions completely outside the control of the central government. Areas in the northern and eastern parts of Burkina Faso were particularly affected as militant groups carried out regular attacks on civilians, government institutions, and military outposts. Regaining control of these areas was crucial to restoring national unity and ensuring that Burkina Faso could effectively defend its sovereignty. A central part of this territorial reclamation strategy was the increased militarization of key regions. Traore's government increased the number of military bases and checkpoints throughout the country, particularly in vulnerable regions. This military presence was designed not only to deter insurgents, but also to reassure civilians that the government was serious about securing their safety. Furthermore, Traore understood that in some areas, the military's presence alone was not enough. It was crucial to win the support of the local population, who were often caught between the crossfire of military forces and insurgents. As such, his administration focused on efforts to rebuild trust within these communities, providing humanitarian aid and making efforts to restore basic public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. While strengthening the military was a key element of his strategy, Traore was also mindful of the need to engage in regional cooperation to tackle the broader threat of terrorism. He worked to strengthen relationships with neighboring countries that were similarly facing the threat of extremist groups. This included increased cooperation with Mali and Niger, two other Sahelian countries that had been battling jihadist insurgencies for years. Traore sought to coordinate military efforts across the region, conducting joint operations and sharing intelligence to disrupt extremist networks. The Sahel region, with its porous borders and underdeveloped infrastructure, required a collaborative approach to combat the spread of terrorism, and Traore understood that Burkina Faso's efforts would be more effective if they were part of a larger regional security strategy. However, while his military actions and focus on national security won him significant support from many Burkinabe citizens, there were also challenges. Critics argued that the military's heavy-handed approach, including the increased use of force and militarization of certain regions, risked exacerbating tensions between the government and local populations. Furthermore, the growing reliance on the military to solve what was fundamentally a political and social crisis raised concerns about the long-term stability of the country. Critics worried that a purely militaristic solution might undermine efforts to restore democratic governance and address the root causes of the insurgency, such as poverty, inequality, and political exclusion. In the face of these challenges, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's focus on national security remained unwavering. His leadership during a time of profound crisis demonstrated a clear commitment to protecting the people of Burkina Faso, even if it meant taking difficult and sometimes controversial actions. His approach reflected a growing understanding that national security could not be achieved through military force alone, but that military strength, when combined with strategic partnerships and efforts to win civilian support, would be key to the country's long-term stability and peace. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré orchestrated the coup that ousted Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba in September 2022, his actions were met with immediate controversy, both domestically and internationally. The overthrow of the military leader had only taken place a few months earlier, in January 2022, and many had hoped that the new government under Damiba would be able to address the growing security crisis caused by jihadist insurgencies. However, as the insurgency worsened, Traoré's decision to stage another coup reflected the deep dissatisfaction with the military leadership and the belief that radical change was needed. While his actions were widely criticized by international bodies like ECOWAS and Western powers, who saw the coup as a setback for democracy in Burkina Faso, Many Burkinabe citizens viewed him as a necessary leader capable of restoring order to a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. Burkina Faso's struggle with security challenges had grown more intense over the years, with extremist groups claiming increasing control over parts of the country. The central government, first under President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore and later under Damiba, seemed unable to effectively tackle the growing violence. Civilians were increasingly caught in the crossfire, with large numbers of people displaced from their homes, entire villages overrun, and the country's military forces struggling to hold ground. As the violence spread, it became clear that the situation was spiraling out of control, leading to widespread frustration among the population. Public protests against the government's handling of the security crisis were common, with many citizens demanding stronger action and a shift in leadership. When Captain Traore came to power, many saw him as a beacon of hope. His military background and swift action to depose Damiba were viewed by a large portion of the population as a necessary step to address the growing security threats. For many Burkinabe, Traore's rise was not just about a change in leadership. It was a signal that the country was ready to do whatever was necessary to restore peace and stability, even if it meant a return to military rule. This sentiment was especially prevalent among those who felt abandoned by the previous governments, which had been unable to protect them from the rising tide of violence. Traore's rhetoric resonated with those who had lost faith in political leaders and believed that only through strong military leadership could Burkina Faso regain its security and sovereignty. The widespread public support for Traore was reflected in the celebrations that followed his coup. Many Burkinabe citizens expressed relief, believing that his leadership would mark a turning point in the country's ongoing crisis. His promises to prioritize the safety of the people and to tackle the insurgency head-on struck a chord with a populace that had lived through years of fear, displacement, and uncertainty. In interviews with civilians and through social media, there was a sense that Traore, as a young and dynamic leader, could bring fresh energy to the fight against terrorism, something that the previous leaders had failed to do. His calls for national unity and his commitment to restoring order were seen as a departure from the ineffective responses of the past, making him a figure who embodied hope for a better future. Despite the domestic support for his actions, Traore's coup did not escape criticism from international bodies, especially from ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, and the Western powers. ECOWAS, which has long advocated for democratic governance in West Africa, condemned the coup, calling for the restoration of civilian rule and a return to constitutional order. The West, including France, which had been a key partner in Burkina Faso's counterterrorism efforts, also expressed dismay over the military's repeated interference in the country's political processes. These international reactions were based on concerns over the stability of Burkina Faso's democracy, the potential for a prolonged military dictatorship, and the negative precedent it set for other countries in the region. The condemnation from these international entities raised questions about the legitimacy of Traore's rule and whether his government would be able to navigate the complex web of regional and international diplomacy. However, while the international community focused on the legitimacy of the coup and the implications for democracy, many Burkinabe citizens were less concerned with the political process and more focused on their immediate survival. For them, Traore's ability to restore security and bring an end to the suffering caused by the insurgency was paramount. The promise of a more secure future, free from the constant threat of extremist violence, was seen as more important than the question of military versus civilian governance. The popular support for Traore's leadership, while strong, was not without its complexities. The Burkinabe people were deeply divided on the issue of military rule, and while many viewed his rise as a necessary response to the security crisis, others expressed concerns about the long-term effects of repeated military coups on the country's democratic institutions. There was a recognition that while the military's involvement had brought temporary stability, it also risked perpetuating a cycle of authoritarian rule that could further undermine the country's political development. Nonetheless, for a significant portion of the population, Traore's leadership was seen as a beacon of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. In conclusion, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power was marked by a complex interplay of domestic support and international criticism. While the international community viewed his actions with skepticism, especially in terms of its implications for democracy and regional stability, many Burkinabe citizens saw him as a necessary leader in a time of crisis. His leadership, though controversial, was viewed as a critical step toward restoring security and addressing the growing threats of extremism that had plagued the country for years. In the eyes of many, Captain Traoré offered hope where there had been none, positioning himself as the leader Burkina Faso needed to begin its journey toward stability once again. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power in Burkina Faso was propelled by a desperate need for effective leadership in the face of an intensifying security crisis. His military coup in September 2022, which ousted his predecessor, Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, was widely supported domestically, as many Burkinabe citizens were desperate for a leader who could restore security and order in a country ravaged by insurgency and extremist violence. While his leadership focused on military solutions to the security challenges the country faced, Traoré's rule is fraught with significant challenges, particularly the delicate balance between military rule and the return to democratic governance. Traoré's military-backed leadership has drawn heavy criticism from the international community, particularly from regional organizations like the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and Western powers. Both groups have expressed strong concerns about the erosion of Burkina Faso's democratic institutions following yet another military coup. ECOWAS, which has been a proponent of civilian-led governance in the region, condemned the coup and called for a swift return to constitutional order. Similarly, France, which had been involved in counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel region, voiced its disapproval of the military takeover, stressing the importance of returning to democratic governance. The backlash from the international community primarily focuses on the legitimacy of Traoré's rule. A country that has experienced successive military coups risks falling into a cycle of authoritarianism, where the military governs without any significant accountability or regard for democratic principles. This raises significant questions about the future of democracy in Burkina Faso. While Traoré's government has garnered substantial domestic support for its promises to address security concerns, the wider international community views the situation with skepticism, as it threatens the long-term stability of Burkina Faso's political institutions. For Traoré, navigating the tensions between military rule and democracy has been one of the most complex aspects of his leadership. His government faces the difficult task of transitioning from military control to a more stable democratic system, while maintaining the support of the military, which holds significant power in the country. The challenge lies in balancing the urgent need for security and order with the long-term goal of restoring civilian governance. It is clear that while military rule may provide short-term stability, a lasting solution for Burkina Faso requires the establishment of democratic institutions that can address the underlying political and social issues that have contributed to the current crisis. In addition to the pressure from the international community, there is also the matter of internal divisions within Burkina Faso. While the military has largely supported Traoré's leadership, the question of how to transition from military rule to a civilian government remains unresolved. The Burkinabe people, having lived through years of insecurity and political instability, are deeply divided over how to move forward. Some view the military's involvement as a necessary response to the nation's ongoing security challenges, while others fear that the repeated military takeovers may undermine the democratic process altogether. These internal divisions create a volatile political environment where the military leadership is both a source of stability and a potential barrier to the restoration of civilian rule. One of the key concerns in this transition is the question of governance and accountability. For Burkina Faso to rebuild its political institutions, there will need to be meaningful steps toward democratic governance, including the establishment of a constitution, the protection of human rights, and the creation of independent institutions that can ensure checks and balances on power. However, the military's entrenched role in government complicates this process. Historically, Burkina Faso's military has been closely involved in political affairs, and each successive military ruler has faced pressure to maintain control over the country's governance. This makes the prospect of a smooth transition to democracy uncertain, as the military may be reluctant to relinquish power without significant assurances that its interests will be safeguarded. Furthermore, the risk of exacerbating tensions between the military and civilian institutions remains high. If Traore's government pushes too aggressively for a return to democracy without the military's full cooperation, it could spark resistance within the ranks, leading to further instability. Conversely, if the military continues to hold significant power and influence, it may undermine any efforts to restore civilian rule, leading to a protracted period of authoritarian governance. The path forward is unclear, and Traore's ability to manage this delicate balance will be critical to the future political landscape of Burkina Faso. In terms of practical steps, Traore has committed to a transition to democracy, though the timeline for such a process remains vague. His government has indicated that it intends to hold elections at some point, but the exact nature and timing of those elections are still under discussion. The challenge here is to ensure that the transition is not rushed or manipulated in a way that allows the military to retain significant control. For this transition to succeed, there will need to be widespread support for democratic reforms, as well as strong institutions capable of overseeing the electoral process and ensuring that it is free, fair, and inclusive. In conclusion, while Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership has been largely focused on restoring national security, the road ahead is fraught with challenges in terms of balancing military rule with a return to democratic governance. While his actions have garnered significant domestic support, particularly in the context of the ongoing security crisis, his leadership faces scrutiny from both the international community and internal factions within Burkina Faso. Successfully managing this balance will be crucial in determining whether the country can emerge from its current cycle of instability and create a more sustainable and democratic future. The stakes are high, and Traoré's ability to navigate this complex political terrain will ultimately shape the course of Burkina Faso's future. The future of Burkina Faso hinges on the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his ability to stabilize the country amidst an ever-growing security crisis and political turmoil. The situation in Burkina Faso is both urgent and complex, as the country grapples with increasing extremist violence, displacement, and humanitarian needs, while simultaneously facing significant internal and external political challenges. Traoré's leadership will ultimately determine the trajectory of Burkina Faso's future, as well as its broader impact on the stability of the West African region. His decisions, both domestically and on the international stage, will not only shape his legacy, but also have profound consequences for the political and security landscape of the entire Sahel region. At the core of Burkina Faso's future lies the critical need for stability, which has eluded the country for years. Since the violent insurgency began in 2015, extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have taken control of large portions of the country, particularly in the north and east. The escalating violence has forced hundreds of thousands of Burkinabe citizens to flee their homes, creating one of the fastest growing displacement crises in the region. The local economy has been severely impacted, and basic public services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure have been weakened or dismantled. In the face of this national crisis, Traoré's ability to restore security will be the most important factor in determining the country's future.